June 14, 1944. 8 days after D-Day. The hedgerow country south of Corentin was a maze of dirt tracks, stone walls, and German artillery waiting behind every tree line. Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski's M4A1 Sherman screeched to a stop behind a moss-covered stone wall. The engine coughed and rattled, stalling for half a second before catching again. Through the periscope, Kowalski watched fire pour from a Sherman 300 yards ahead. Flames licked the sky, black smoke coiling into a dark column. The crew had bailed out, running through waist-high grass, until one of them stumbled. Another turned back to help. A second later, an armor-piercing shell slammed into the burning tank. The turret launched 12 feet into the air like a coin flipped by the gods. Both men vanished in the blast. That was the fourth Sherman lost in 20 minutes. Kowalski keyed the radio. Baker 2-3 to Baker Actual. We've got a concealed 88 in the tree line. Request smoke and withdrawal. Static. Then the reply. Negative on withdrawal. Intelligence reports minimal armor presence. Continue advance. Minimal armor presence. Right. Someone in a clean uniform back in Cherbourg was reading yesterday's recon report while today's tankers burned to death. Kowalski looked left. His loader, Private Danny Castellano, 19, Brooklyn. Kid looked like he was trying not to throw up, hands trembling as he checked the ready rack. 40 shells within reach. 17 more in the turret basket. 30 tucked into the sponsons, thin-skinned storage bins running along the hull, just inches above the tracks. 51 75mm rounds in total. 51 chances to die if the tank got hit wrong. Driver, forward. 50 yards. Gunner, watch that tree line. The tank rolled forward with a groan of steel on steel. Corporal James Morrison, the gunner, scanned through his sight. No movement, Sarge. I've got nothing. He's there, Kowalski said. Took out 4 of ours. He's waiting. 30 yards forward. The wall fell behind them. The tank was now exposed in the open. Silhouetted. Perfect target. Kowalski's palms were slick on the commander's override handle. Every instinct screamed get back, get out, but orders were orders. Minimal armor presence. The shell hit low. It slammed through the right side sponson like a hammer through drywall. Shallow angle, full velocity. Kowalski felt it before he heard it. A hollow metallic crack, then a split second of dead silence before a pressure wave knocked the air out of his lungs. Inside the crew compartment, fragments sprayed like shrapnel from a hand grenade. One tore through the ammo rack. The propellant charges ignited instantly. Boom, boom, boom. The right sponson became a chain reaction blast chamber. Shells detonated in rapid succession. The temperature inside the Sherman jumped from 80 to over 400 degrees in 3 seconds. Castellano screamed. The ready rack was on fire. 4 shells exploded at once behind him, turning his station into a blast furnace. Kowalski lunged, grabbed the kid's shoulder, tried to drag him toward the hatch. Castellano's uniform was already aflame. The smell of burning cloth, flesh, and hot steel filled the tank. Morrison didn't wait. The gunner kicked his hatch open and dove out in one motion, hitting the engine deck with a thud and rolling hard. Kowalski shoved Castellano toward the same hatch. The kid was still screaming. Not words, just raw, panicked sound. Animal. Helpless. Kowalski had him halfway out of the hatch, shoulders through, boots still inside, when the turret basket detonated. The blast slammed the hatch shut like a guillotine. The impact hurled Kowalski backwards into the radio set. Plastic shattered. Something cracked in his shoulder. He hit the floor hard and stayed there, stunned. His mouth filled with the taste of copper. Blood. He tried to move his left arm. Nothing. Dead weight. Smoke filled the compartment. Thick, black, chemical. The kind that strips the air from your lungs. He couldn't see the loader anymore. Couldn't see anything. Just flame-lit shadows and the flicker of dying light. He moved by feel. Hands found the commander's hatch. The steel was red-hot, burning through his gloves. He braced, pushed with his good shoulder, screamed as the metal bit through layers of canvas and flesh. The hatch gave. Daylight poured in. The fresh air hit him like a slap. He pulled himself out, rolled off the turret, and fell 6 feet to the dirt. He landed hard. The wind knocked clean out of him. He didn't get up. He crawled. 10 feet. 20. Then his arms gave out. He collapsed in the tall grass. Behind him, the Sherman was burning. Flames poured from every vision port, every open seam. The tank groaned like something alive, steel flexing under heat, ammunition still detonating in savage, irregular bursts. One final shell cooked off in the turret, lifting the gun an inch before it slammed back down. Kowalski didn't cry. He just watched. 5 minutes later, Morrison found him. The gunner's face was blistered and scorched. His uniform still smoked in places. He dropped beside the sergeant and looked back at the tank. "Where's Castellano?" Kowalski didn't answer. He didn't need to. 3 miles east, in a different hedgerow, a different story unfolded. Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes stood in the commander's hatch of a Sherman tank. His platoon, 4M4A1S, moved through the same maze of stone, brush, and death that had eaten Kowalski alive. Same countryside, same German guns. But Hayes had something different. All 4 of his tanks bore the new designation, M4A176W. He hadn't given the marking much thought when he'd signed for the tanks back in England. The quartermaster had pointed it out, mentioned something about ammunition racks and water jackets, fire suppression. Hayes had nodded, not listening. He was focused on the big thing, the 76mm gun. More velocity, better penetration. That's what mattered, he thought. That's what saved lives in a tank fight. He was wrong. Sergeant William Drake's tank led the column. It rolled around a bocage corner and took a hit. A German Panzer IV, hull down in the brush, fired from 300 yards. The shell slammed into the Sherman's side, right through the sponson, exactly where Kowalski's tank had been hit. Hayes, watching through his binoculars, braced himself. He knew what came next. The secondary explosion. The flash fire. The turret lifting like a toy. The crew, if lucky, flailing out on fire. But that didn't happen. Drake's Sherman rocked from the impact. Smoke poured from the entry hole, but no fireball. No cook-off. No eruption of ammunition. The tank stayed intact. 5 seconds passed. Then the 76mm main gun barked. The Sherman's turret rotated with mechanical calm and punched around through the Panzer's frontal armor. The German tank locked, shuddered, and went still. Smoke coiled from its engine deck. Drake's voice crackled over the radio. "Hit on the side. No breach. We're still green. Returning fire." Hayes exhaled. Slowly. Eyes still locked on the Sherman. His tank hadn't exploded. His men weren't burning. The W meant something after all. Baker 31 to Baker actual. We're hit, but mobile. Right sponson, penetration. No casualties. Ammunition racks intact. Continuing advance. Hayes stared at the handset like it had grown fangs. No casualties. Ammunition racks intact. That wasn't possible. He'd seen what happened when a Sherman took a sponson hit. You didn't continue advance. You called for body bags. You radioed for stretcher teams and priests. You watched a 30-ton tank erupt like a funeral pyre and prayed it wouldn't be you next. But now Drake's crew was still rolling. Still fighting. Hayes keyed the mic. "Drake, say again. You took a sponson penetration?" "Affirmative," Drake replied. "Went right through the ammo rack area, but nothing cooked off. Shell must have missed. Rounds are stored in some kind of liquid containers. Down on the hull floor. Everything's sealed. Liquid containers. Ammunition racks on the hull floor." It clicked. Wet stowage. Hayes's eyes widened. He remembered now. The quartermaster back in England, rattling off specs nobody had cared about. New Sherman variant. M4A176W. W for wet stowage. Ammunition no longer stuffed along the sponsons, now stored in sealed floor bins surrounded by a glycol water mixture. A DIY fire suppression system. If the compartment was breached, the liquid would spill over the racks, dousing any flame before it could reach the propellant. At the time, Hayes had barely listened. He was interested in one thing, the 76mm high-velocity gun. More kill power. More punch against Panthers. Everything else had felt like a footnote. But not anymore. Now, it was the difference between a dead loader and one drinking coffee after the fight. They pushed forward. In the next 4 hours, Hayes's platoon, 4 Shermans, engaged 6 German tanks and 8 anti-tank positions. The Germans had the range, the angles, the concealment. They fired first. They scored hits. 11 rounds penetrated armor. 3 Shermans were disabled, one with a thrown track, one with an engine fire, one stuck in a drainage ditch. But none brewed up. None exploded. None turned into steel coffins with screaming men clawing at hatches. Wet stowage didn't stop tanks from being killed. but it stopped crews from dying with them. By nightfall, Hayes had 1 tank out of the fight, 3 still rolling, and 0 dead crew. 3 wounded. Burns, mostly. None critical. He called in the status report. The voice on the other end didn't even try to hide the disbelief. What the hell kind of magic tanks are you driving? Hayes looked at the blackened Sherman parked behind a hedgerow. The right flank was scorched from a near miss. The paint blistered like it had been peeled by dragon's breath. The crew inside were alive, boiling water on a field stove, laughing about the German gunner's aim. He keyed the radio again. Not magic, Hayes said. Just better engineering. 300 miles east, outside Falaise, in a Wehrmacht tank depot, a different kind of report landed on the desk of Oberleutnant Klaus Wehrer. Wehrer had spent 2 years on the Eastern Front. He commanded a Panzer IV company, hard men, veterans all, now reassigned to the Western Theater to help stop the Allied breakout. He lit a cigarette with a hand that shook ever so slightly. The intelligence packet in front of him detailed engagement results from the American 3rd Armored Division. Sherman losses were high, but crew casualties were down. Drastically down. Penetrating hits weren't producing explosions. Ammunition wasn't cooking off. Wehrer frowned. He reread the translated interrogation transcript from a captured American tanker. New stowage system. Wet racks. Ammunition submerged in liquid. Doesn't blow when hit. He flipped through after-action photos. American Shermans, visibly damaged, visibly penetrated, but no blackened craters. No blown-off turrets. Crew hatches open. He muttered under his breath. Verdanter Yankee trick. Accursed Yankee trick. If it was true, the American tanks weren't indestructible, but they were suddenly less vulnerable. Crews were surviving. That meant more tanks returned to the fight. More gunners lived to fire another shot. More pressure on the German line. Wehrer reached for his field phone. I need every report on these so-called wet rack Shermans. Now. And I want gun crews rebriefed. Hull shots only. If you see the new gun, aim for the turret ring. We're not killing tanks anymore. We're only killing time. He stubbed out his cigarette. Outside, rain was falling. The front was moving west. The report was unsettling. Stark. No exaggeration, no flourish. Just cold, efficient intelligence. American Sherman tanks were no longer brewing up when hit in their ammunition racks. Oberleutnant Klaus Wehrer read it twice. Then a third time. It made no sense. Since North Africa, every German tank commander knew the formula. Hit the Sherman in the sponson or the turret basket. Aim for the racks. You didn't just disable the tank, you incinerated it. The ammunition detonated like a buried mine. Flames roared from every hatch. The crew either died instantly or bailed out into a spray of machine gun fire. That was the doctrine. That was the advantage. That's how he had killed 11 Shermans during the brutal retreat from Kursk. But this report said the game had changed. Recent engagements claimed Shermans were taking direct hits to traditional weak points, without secondary explosions. Tanks burned less often. Crews were escaping. Tanks were surviving. Wehrer summoned his platoon commanders to the command trailer. He read the report aloud. The silence was brief. Then came the predictable snorts. Propaganda, said Hauptfeldwebel Ernst Becker, his grizzled lead tank commander. Americans want us to think their tanks are invincible. Psychological warfare. Maybe, Wehrer said. But maybe not. He leaned forward. If they've solved the brew-up problem, we have a bigger problem. Because our doctrine relies on killing Shermans quickly. If they don't explode anymore, if their crews can stay in the fight, then we need to adapt, fast. The words settled like dust. No one laughed this time. The next morning, outside Villers-Bocage, Wheerer's company lay in wait. 8 Shermans approached, stretched in staggered formation across the open Normandy farmland. Fast. Confident. No visible infantry support. Arrogant, Wehrer thought. Perfect ambush conditions. His Panzer IVs were dug in along a tree line. Hull down. Camouflaged. Clear fields of fire across the open crop rows. This would be textbook. Wheerer's gunner called it in. Target acquired. Sherman. 800 meters. Sponson shot. Ready. Fire. The 75mm cannon boomed. The round punched into the lead Sherman's right side, just above the tracks. Direct hit. Wehrer waited, ready to call the kill. But nothing happened. No fireball. No turret blast. No black smoke. The Sherman staggered sideways from the impact and stopped, tracks likely severed. Smoke hissed from the entry wound. Then the turret turned. Smoothly. Precisely. The gun elevated. 5 seconds later, the Sherman fired back. The round screamed high, shattering branches behind Vierer's position. But that wasn't the point. The point was the Sherman was still alive. Still fighting. Vierer's second tank opened fire. The shell struck the damaged Sherman in the turret front, but ricocheted off the mantlet with a bright white scar. The American fired again. This time it hit home. Vierer's 2nd Panzer IV took the round in the hull. The tank erupted. Ammunition cooked off instantly. The turret lifted and dropped. The crew never had a chance. Vierers got twisted. This wasn't right. They were in perfect ambush position. They had veteran crews. They hit first, and somehow the Shermans were winning. Then came the charge. The remaining 5 Shermans advanced, not cautiously, not tactically, but full throttle, straight into the teeth of the ambush. Suicidal, Vierer thought. His gunners reacted fast, firing 3 more rounds. 2 hit. One Sherman's track shredded, sending it skidding sideways. It ground to a halt, immobile, but the other 4 kept coming, firing on the move. The 76mm guns barked as high-explosive rounds smashed into the tree line, turning cover into chaos. With splinters, shattered optics, ripped camouflage netting, the ground rocked with impact. Vierer ducked as a blast blew bark into his face. He shouted orders, but the noise drowned him out. His ambush was disintegrating under sheer weight of fire. This wasn't a column of tin cans with flammable hearts anymore. This was a spear, and the head refused to melt. He crawled to his optics again and spotted the first Sherman, the one they'd hit, still motionless but alive. Smoke seeped from its flank. Its crew had popped the hatches and were crawling away. 2 of them stood. Walked. Vierer watched in disbelief. They should be dead. He dropped his binoculars. Turned to Becker. We need new doctrine. Becker didn't argue. The order was quiet. Resigned. Withdraw. 3 of Oberleutnant Vierer's Panzer IVs reversed from the shredded tree line, engines howling as they retreated through the mud and smoke. 2 others didn't make it. One brewed up in seconds, hit square in the glacis by a 76mm round that burned through its frontal armor like a welding torch. The second took a hit to the turret ring and detonated in place, its hatches bursting open under the pressure. Across the field, the Americans had lost 2 Shermans. Both disabled. Neither destroyed. No casualties Vierer could confirm. No fireballs. No turrets tossed skyward. Just 2 scorched tanks, and 5 Shermans still standing. That evening, inside his command post, Vierer lit a cigarette with shaking fingers and began writing his after-action report. He didn't embellish. Didn't theorize. Just facts, tight and clinical. Enemy. U.S. Sherman tanks. Location, south of Villers-Bocage. Time, 08:13 to 09:02 hours. Engagement, Panzer ambush from Treline, 5 tanks engaged, 8 Shermans encountered. Result, 3 Panzers escaped, 2 destroyed. 2 Shermans disabled. No visible crew casualties. Observation, multiple penetrating hits against Sherman sponsons and turret baskets failed to ignite ammunition. No catastrophic explosions. All crew members from disabled vehicles appeared to escape unscathed. Recommendation, immediate investigation. Tactical doctrine must be reevaluated. 3 days later, the report arrived at Army Group B headquarters. It was not the first. Similar after-action accounts had begun flooding in from panzer commanders across the entire Normandy front. Something was happening. Something unnerving. American Shermans were surviving hits that should have killed them. Crews were bailing out of shattered tanks alive, often rejoining the fight in spare vehicles within the same day. Fuel fires still happened, tracks were still blown off, but the feared brew-up was disappearing. The psychological toll on German tank crews was growing. The old equations no longer applied. The Americans had changed the game. 5,000 miles away, in Detroit, Michigan, the answer rolled down an assembly line at a blistering pace. Inside the vast hangars of the Fisher Body Division, a General Motors subsidiary that had traded car doors and fenders for steel plates and gun mantlets, men in oil-streaked coveralls oversaw the birth of a revolution. The plant was now fully dedicated to producing M4A3 Sherman tanks, and every single one bore a small, unassuming letter stenciled next to its serial number. W. Wet stowage. To the untrained eye, the W meant nothing. But to a Sherman crew, it meant life. The concept wasn't complicated. Traditional Shermans stored ammunition in steel racks welded to the hull sides, the sponsons, just above the tracks. Easy to access, easy to hit. A penetrating shot would pass through the armor, strike a propellant charge, and trigger an inferno. So engineers redesigned the system. Ammunition was relocated to sealed steel bins sunk into the floor of the hull, behind armor and below the fighting compartment. Each bin held 10 75mm or 76mm shells, separated by canisters filled with a chemical mixture, water, ethylene glycol, and rust inhibitor. The mixture had a name, Amulamp. When a shell penetrated the hull and breached an ammo bin, these liquid canisters ruptured, flooding the interior and quenching any flame before it could ignite the propellant. Simple chemistry, simple physics, brutally effective. The change added 900 pounds to the tank's weight, but it reduced ammunition fire incidents by 85%. That meant something Sherman crews had rarely known before, a second chance. They could now survive what used to be fatal. Production of the new variant, M4A1-76W, began in January 1944. By April, 130 wet stowage Shermans had been crated, sealed, and shipped to England in preparation for the invasion of Europe. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions received 52 each. But old habits and red tape got in the way. Concerns over crew training with the new 76mm high-velocity gun caused the upgraded Shermans to sit idle in depots. Logistics officers didn't want to complicate the D-Day landing. Best to stick with what was familiar. The troops stormed ashore on June 6th with older models, dry stowage racks, 75mm guns, and the same vulnerabilities that had haunted them since North Africa. The fire would return to Normandy. But 8 days after D-Day, as the hedgerow battles turned into a meat grinder and Shermans died by the dozen in narrow fields and stone-choked lanes, commanders began requesting any tank that could keep its crew alive. And the forgotten M4A1-76WS were finally called up. July 25, 1944, Normandy. At precisely 1,100 hours, the ground began to shake. Operation Cobra had begun. A carpet of 3,000 Allied bombers tore a 6-mile hole in the German front line south of St. Lo. The skies rained fire. Earth convulsed. Trees vanished. Men disappeared. And into that man-made earthquake, American tanks surged forward. Leading the charge were the tanks some crews had waited months to receive. M4A1-76W Shermans. The W finally meant something. They rolled past the craters and the burning fields, through holes where the hedgerows had been pulverized. Infantry followed in their wake, ducking behind armor they no longer feared would betray them with an internal explosion. And then the test came. A Panzer IV ambush, hastily organized, caught one of the new Shermans at 500 yards. The armor-piercing round struck true, just above the right track, directly into the sponson. Crew inside felt the impact. They heard the scream of steel, but the tank did not ignite. The ammunition sat in its wet-sealed bins, splashed with ethylene glycol and water, nestled low in the belly of the tank. The round had struck the rack, but there was no chain reaction. No screaming. No fire. Just shock. Just silence. The Sherman stayed intact. The crew stayed alive. The return fire came 5 seconds later, a 76mm round punching through the Panzer's side and sending the turret up in smoke. By nightfall, the word was spreading like wildfire through the armored divisions. The new Shermans don't blow. Tankers who had watched friends incinerated in dry stowage death traps were now seeing something unthinkable. Crews walking away from penetrations. Surviving. Fighting back. The effect on morale was instant. Tactics changed overnight. Commanders stopped holding back. Crews stopped hesitating. Sherman started charging. Where once caution ruled, now aggression thrived. For the first time, Sherman crews had something approaching faith in their machines. By August 1944, Fisher Body was delivering the next iteration of survivable Shermans to the front in bulk. The M4A3-75W, still armed with the familiar 75mm gun, but fitted with wet stowage as standard, was rolling off Detroit lines at a rate of 371 tanks per month. Every tank that reached France was one less death trap. Older models were cycled out, either sent back to rear-line depots or written off after catastrophic loss. Armored divisions swapped their burned-out hulls for survivors. The balance shifted, one tank at a time. The battlefield was changing. The Germans noticed. Intelligence intercepts described new American aggressiveness. Tank units no longer avoided ambushes, they charged into them. Shermans were being disabled, but not destroyed. Crews were seen holding position in knocked-out tanks, coordinating over radios while recovery vehicles dragged them back behind friendly lines. The psychological edge, the brew-up kill, was gone. German tank commanders responded the only way they could. They aimed for mobility, track shots, engine blocks, transmission kills. Take the Sherman's legs. Leave it immobile. Let artillery finish the job. But even that wasn't easy anymore. American infantry rode close. Tank destroyers flanked the columns. Artillery overwatch was constant. Air cover was never far. The Americans had learned combined arms warfare, and they perfected it. The wet stowage didn't make the Sherman invincible. It was still vulnerable to the 88mm pack guns hidden in barns, behind walls, beneath foliage. Panther tanks still outranged it. Tigers were still monsters. But the Sherman had shed its coffin reputation. It could take a hit. It could fight through damage. And in a war measured in lives, not numbers, survivability was firepower. September 1944. Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski returned to the front. He stepped off the half-track with one good arm, a scarred face, and a new assignment. Commander of an M4A3 75W. When he climbed inside, the first thing he noticed was the ammunition racks, lower now, sunken into the hull floor, locked in armored bins. His new loader, Private Gregson, pointed to the sealed containers next to the racks. That's the wet stowage system, Sarge. Filled with some chemical soup. If we get hit, it floods the rounds so they don't light off. Kowalski nodded once, said nothing. He sat in the commander's seat. The familiar vibration of the engine rose through the floor. He looked down at the new ammo racks. And for the first time since Normandy, he didn't feel like he was already half dead just by climbing into a tank. They call it wet stowage, the loader said, wiping his hands on a rag. Supposed to keep us from burning if we take a hit. Kowalski ran his glove along the smooth steel casing of the ammo bin. It was cold, sealed, heavy, nothing like the exposed racks he remembered from Normandy. Does it work? The loader shrugged. I don't know, Sarge. Haven't been hit yet. Let's keep it that way. But war doesn't care what you want. 3 weeks later, near Oni-Sorotin, 700 meters. A Panther. The flash came first. The hit followed like a hammer through the hull. An armor-piercing shell punched through the right sponson, the exact spot where Castellano had died. Same angle, same impact point, same nightmare. Kowalski felt himself thrown sideways, slammed against the turret wall. Smoke filled the compartment. The loader screamed, raw, animal panic, but there was no follow-up explosion. No internal fireworks turning the tank into a tomb. Just smoke. Just the hiss of liquid draining from ruptured containers. The wet stowage had done its job. Kowalski didn't hesitate. He grabbed the loader by his collar and shoved him toward the commander's hatch. The kid scrambled out, coughing but alive. The gunner bailed. The driver bailed. The assistant driver bailed. Kowalski was last. He hauled himself through the hatch, boots slipping on scorched paint, rolled off the engine deck, and hit the grass hard. They all made it. 5 men. 0 casualties. Behind him, the Sherman was still burning. Flames licked at the hull, crawled toward the turret ring. But the ammo hadn't gone off. The sealed bins had held. The propellant was intact, suffocating in its liquid cocoon. Eventually, the engine fire might reach it. Eventually, the heat might be enough. But by then, the crew would be 200 yards away, behind cover, behind friendly lines. That was the point. Not immunity, just time. Seconds. Kowalski lay in the grass and stared at the rising smoke. He thought about Castellano, the kid who screamed until the ammunition racks ignited. He thought about the other crews, 11 Shermans that brewed up before this one didn't. He thought about how all of it came down to 1,000 pounds of extra weight and some weird chemical stew inside armored canisters. The wet stowage didn't bring the dead back, but it kept the next crew alive. And in this war, that was enough. He stood up, dusted himself off, walked back to HQ. Requesting replacement, he told the captain. M4A3 75 if you've got one. He knew now that survival wasn't about being indestructible. It was about buying time. Seconds to find a hatch. Seconds to drag a man out. Seconds to get clear. And on a battlefield measured in flashes and screams, those seconds were the difference between a burial and a beer back at camp. Origins of a life-saving idea. The technology that saved Kowalski's life didn't come from a battlefield. It came from a conference room. November 1943. A DuPont chemical engineer sat in a tank board meeting, listening to statistics on crew mortality and ammunition fires. When it came his turn to speak, he offered a radical idea. What if we surrounded the ammunition with water? Silence. At first, the idea was absurd. Some early proposals went too far. Flood the whole fighting compartment. Build a tank like a submarine. Crew wears oxygen masks, submerged in water that would smother any flame. It didn't take long to realize that was a death trap all its own. So they scaled it back. Applied logic. Engineering. Double-walled ammo bins. Fluid-filled jackets. Place them low, in the floor of the hull, away from common penetration zones. Don't let the round sit in water, let the water sit around the round. If the compartment was breached, the liquid would spill. It would cool the heat, quench the spark, drown the fire before it reached the powder. It wasn't magic. It was chemistry and courage, bolted into steel. Each 10-round rack was redesigned, broken into cells separated by sealed steel containers filled with a chemical fire suppressant. Not just water. That was the first mistake. Water froze. Froze solid inside unheated tanks during bitter European winters. Worse, it corroded the brass shell casings and internal bins. The next iteration used ethylene glycol, the same chemical found in antifreeze. It solved the freezing problem but came with two new ones: accelerated corrosion and a disturbing flammability at high temperatures. A fire suppression system that might catch fire. That wasn't going to work. The final solution was a proprietary compound developed in cooperation with DuPont. Amudamp, a colorless liquid with a dense, chemical scent. Ethyl sodium potassium phosphate blended with rust inhibitors and biocides. It stayed fluid at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, didn't corrode brass, prevented microbial growth in sealed bins, and extinguished flame faster than water ever could. Each Sherman now carried dozens of sealed fluid cells. 38 gallons for the 75 mm variants, 36 gallons for the 76 mm. It was a chemical moat for each shell, an invisible barrier between survival and inferno. The upgrade added 900 pounds to the Sherman's weight, an inconvenience for logistics, but irrelevant to the men inside. Because what the numbers showed was stunning. Before the modification, 60 to 80% of Shermans that took a penetrating hit burned. After wet stowage, only 10 to 15% ignited. An 85% reduction in internal fires. That wasn't just survivability. It was sustainability. A Sherman battalion with 50 tanks taking 30 hits could expect to lose 18 to 24 tanks permanently if using dry stowage. With the wet stowage system, only 3 to 5 would burn. The rest could be recovered, repaired, redeployed. Crews lived. Experience stayed in the fight. The first wet Shermans rolled out quietly. Pressed Steel Car Company, Pennsylvania. December 1943. First M4A1 76 W. January 3, 1944. Fisher Body Division, Detroit. February 1944. Began producing the M4A3 75 W. 3,371 units by war's end. From January 1944 onward, nearly every Sherman built incorporated the modification. By VE Day, over 30,000 upgraded tanks had reached combat theaters across Europe and the Pacific. And yet, the Germans never figured it out. They captured hundreds of Shermans from Normandy to the Rhine, pulled them apart, measured armor, fired test rounds into salvaged hulls, reviewed gun performance and optics. One Wehrmacht report estimated that new Shermans were slightly improved in armor quality and hull geometry. But not one German analysis identified the fluid-filled ammo bins. The sealed containers sat in plain sight, beneath the crew's feet, bolted into the floor, thick steel walls filled with a chemical no one in Berlin had thought to investigate. Instead, German intelligence assumed improved crew training, faster bailouts, changes in American infantry tank coordination, better combined arms integration. All true, but all missing the point. By late 1944, Wehrmacht analysts were overwhelmed. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Fuel supplies were drying up. Wunderwaffe projects, jet fighters, V-weapons, reactive armor, consumed every available brain and budget. Nobody was focused on enemy tanks anymore. The Panzerwaffe still thought you killed a Sherman by hitting the sponson. But the brew-up was gone, and no one told them. The information that could have changed everything never made it to the front. Reports filtered upward. Intelligence memos circulated. Some analysts knew. Some engineers understood. But in the chaos of late 1944, as the Reich reeled under the weight of a two-front war, the knowledge didn't flow down. German tank crews still aimed for the sponsons, still trusted in the brew-up, still believed one good hit would turn a Sherman into a funeral pyre. They were fighting ghosts, ghosts of Shermans that no longer existed. Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes survived the war. His platoon, 4M4A1 76 W Shermans, fought across France, through Belgium, into Germany, and reached the Elbe River in April 1945. They saw dozens of engagements, ambushes, tank duels, artillery barrages. They lost 11 tanks to enemy fire. 7 were recovered, repaired, returned. 4 were total losses, catastrophic hits to crew compartments, sheer mechanical destruction, but none of them burned. Not one detonated from internal ammunition fires. And Hayes brought his entire platoon home alive. 20 men. Statistically, half should have died in older Shermans. Dry stowage would have killed them. Wet stowage saved them. In 1947, Hayes attended a veterans' reunion outside Philadelphia. Rows of tents, folding chairs, tables of coffee and cigarettes. Weathered men in worn uniforms stood by their families, some still limping, some still haunted. He met Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski there. They'd never served together, never met in theater. But they didn't need introductions. They recognized each other instantly, not by face, but by the weight behind the eyes. Both had seen Shermans brew up. Both had survived when they shouldn't have. They walked together to a restored M4A3 75 W on display, olive drab, track rusted, steel gleaming in the late sun. Someone had cut away part of the hull to reveal the ammunition storage system, the sealed steel bins, the fire suppressant cells, the quietly brilliant design that changed everything. You know what it was when you first saw it? Hayes asked. Kowalski shook his head slowly. No idea. Loader told me it'd keep us from burning. I didn't believe him until it actually worked. How many times you get hit? 4, Kowalski said. All in wet tanks. Walked away from every one. Hayes nodded. We lost 3. 1 brewed from a crew hit. The other 2 got fixed and sent back. Crews made it out every time. They both looked at the cutaway again. A few feet of steel. A few gallons of fluid. A few seconds bought. Enough to live. Kowalski spoke again. Voice quiet, steady. I had a kid named Castellano. 19. Loader. First tank I ever commanded. Dry stowage. Got hit in the sponson. Ammo cooked off in 5 seconds. He burned screaming. Hayes didn't say anything for a moment. Then he nodded. Mine was a kid from Des Moines. Liked jazz records. Took one in the turret. No time to get out. They stood in silence, staring at the machine that had saved others. Hayes finally spoke. You think they'd have made it if we'd had these back then? Kowalski didn't hesitate. Yeah, they would have made it. I lost 11 friends in Normandy, Kowalski said quietly. All before we got the new tanks. Hayes didn't respond. He didn't have to. Some memories don't need words. They just exist, burned into you like the flash of a muzzle or the scream of turret metal turning molten. The wet stowage system didn't bring anyone back. It didn't undo the horror of North Africa, didn't reverse what happened in Sicily, didn't erase the first weeks of Normandy, when American tanks brewed up by the dozens, crews cooking alive in steel coffins. But after January 1944, once the redesigned Shermans rolled off the line and onto the battlefield, everything changed. Death rates from ammo detonations dropped by 85%. And thousands of tankers, American, British, Canadian, Free French, walked away from hits that would have killed them just months earlier. The Sherman's legacy is still debated. Critics point to thin armor, underpowered guns, catastrophic losses against Panthers and Tigers. Defenders talk about numbers, logistics, reliability, repairability. The fact that a Sherman ran when it needed to and could be built by the thousands. But across all the arguments, across all the documentaries and books and analysis, one fact remains indisputable. Wet stowage changed the Sherman from a death trap into a survivable fighting vehicle. It didn't make it invincible, but it gave tank crews what they'd never had before, a chance. A chance to crawl out. A chance to live. A chance to fight another day. And in war, that's all you can ask for.